WCC reports during the 4th and 5th assessment cycles, was a lead author on the IPCC special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, and is the co-chair of Working Group 2 for the 6th assessment cycle. Dr. Portner, it's a pleasure to have you here to set the scene for how urgently we need integrated approaches to adaptation.
Thank you very much, Emily, and I hope you can all hear me. And can I have the first slide, please? Yeah, thank you very much. We have been very busy during the course of the 6th assessment cycle, and we have, I think, produced the largest number of reports so far in IPCC history. We have produced 3 special reports, one on global warming of 1.5, a second one on climate change and land, and then a third one, which is most important in the context of this event, the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And I will be reporting back on this report, or on these reports as a whole, by doing this from the point of view of Working Group 2, where we are looking at ways of how we can reduce impact and impact severity and guide ambition in mitigation and adaptation. And the main assessment reports of the 6th assessment cycle are the next ones to be published, and we've already seen the one by Working Group 1 being published in August, where which this group is assessing the climate change itself, the physics of climate change, and they have given us sobering news about the trajectory that we are currently on. Next slide, please. Well, the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in the changing climate in a way covers 80% of the Earth's surface, where climate change affects the life-sustaining systems that we all depend on, from the top of the mountains to the depths of the oceans. These changes will continue for generations to come. We have been addressing all the climate-related processes that are challenging the ocean warming, increase in ocean temperature, and associated heat waves, which is a term which was recently coined because heat waves are not just affecting the land, but also the ocean. Then we talk about ocean acidification because anthropogenic CO2 is entering ocean waters and is causing acidity to rise or the pH to decline, affecting especially those organisms that build calcified shells. And then the stratification of the ocean with increased warming is affecting the oxygen content in the ocean, and especially in the midwater layers and in coastal oceans. Oxygen deficiencies are becoming more severe. And there's a lot of interaction to be emphasized between the different parts of this overall system. And last not least, it also concerns ice melt, which is then connected to decreasing sea ice cover in the Arctic that is interfering with our weather patterns and also is connected to sea level rise. So quite an integrated view of the ocean on this slide. Next slide, please. Well, the emphasis should also be that the current background in terms of human uses of the ocean has an issue, a concern about sustainability, and the uses in terms of fisheries and also pollution. Just to remind you of the plastic pollution, current uses are unsustainable as much as current uses of the land are unsustainable. Next slide, please. And if we look at the biodiversity side of things and how they relate to climate, I think these pictures here illustrate in broad scales what's going on in the ocean. And in a way, some of these generalized phrasing is true also for the ecosystems on land. You see with different degrees of warming, talking about 2.4 degrees versus 4.3 degrees warming here, certainly degrees of warming that we would not like to see. You see grayish area, especially in the low latitude, developing and expanding. And this indicates a loss in biodiversity because species are emigrating from these places. They are moving poleward and stay within their preferred temperature ranges. Next, please. And the finding is clearly that these species living down there, or traditionally living down there, are reaching their adaptation limits. There are adaptation limits in ecosystems and species that we need to consider in our adaptation measures. These systems are not as plastic as we might wish them to be, and that these things are already taking effect. You see here in the top part of this figure, where you see the little dip in the center of each of the panels concerning all species, pelagic species and benthic species, reflecting an exacerbation of species losses from these low latitudes setting in already. And we are also in those places losing one of the prominent ecosystems, the warm water coral reef systems, due to the bleaching of those corals. And these systems are on a downslide. They've surpassed the tipping point, and it's rather likely that this also reflects a hard adaptation limit. And on the bottom right, you see actually one key conclusion coming from these patterns, looking at paleo findings and present findings, that there is a biodiversity optimum at about 20 degrees Celsius, which seems to be rather inflexible because it has been expressed in paleo periods as much as during recent periods. And we see this as a clear indication that there is an optimum temperature range that for biodiversity on this planet that we are about to leave by anthropogenic climate change and global warming. Next, please. Certainly, one of the biggest challenges is sea level rise, and that's like all of climate change, it's a long-term challenge. Sea level rise is developing because there's melting of the ice sheets on Greenland, in the Antarctic, and there's glacier mass loss. And there's also ocean warming, as already said, which leads to the expansion of water masses. Next click, please. And this is causing rising sea levels. And we are distinguishing here a scenario of moderate warming, which would take us or keep us more or less close to 1.5 degrees versus one where global warming goes on rather unabated. And you see that this is not only reflected in the degrees of climate change but also in the degree of sea level rise as a consequence, where we can remain below 1 meter sea level rise in a 1.5 degree world, whereas we would go to several meters by 2300 if we let global warming go on virtually unabated. And certainly it was interesting to see that actually, next slide, the Working Group 1 report revisited these issues. And I've mentioned this. Can you take the next slide, please? And then actually in their findings, the Working Group 1 report more or less confirmed the different degrees of sea level rise assessed by the Special Report on Ocean and Cryosphere in 2019, differentiating more between scenarios, and each of these scenarios would have a range of likely sea levels resulting by 2100 and 2150, indicating that especially with the higher degrees of warming, there is no end to this process. It's going on progressively. And there is room for more because there is high uncertainties about the top ranges reached. For example, if you consider that current global temperatures are equivalent to what the globe has seen about 120,000 years ago in the last interglacial, where sea level was 5 to 10 meters higher than currently. So there's uncertainty on the behavior of the ice sheets, and sea level may rise progressively and will rise progressively further, but we are not yet fully sure whether and where there will be an end to this process. Next slide, please. This has implications for the different places, and a lot of human society is living in coastal areas, and the risk from sea level rise is rising in those areas. We have analyzed the risk levels using a color scale approach, the so-called burning ember diagram, where in the top right, you see how we distinguish the undetectable risk, white, from moderate risk, yellow, the high risk to red to very high risk, the purple ranges. And you see that there are places, the urban atoll islands and Arctic communities, especially, and the low-lying coastal areas in general, where this risk develops. And we are comparing different levels of adaptation in those different places. And the resource-rich coastal cities, which have a large capacity to adapt, would actually be able to cover quite a range of sea level rise, even the one described by the high emission scenario, whereas other places, the urban atoll islands, Arctic communities, and also agricultural deltas find it more difficult to adapt under those circumstances. There are adaptation measures in place, and these have been considered in that assessment. Next, please. Where actually we can distinguish between different options: protection using engineering approaches, or accommodation by sort of allowing houses to be built into shallow coastal waters. Ecosystem-based adaptation, where we restore protective marine habitat, and coastal advance, where we recruit land from the ocean. And last not least, which may actually be more advisable in those high-risk places, managed relocation of people from coastal areas. And there may well be combinations of these measures. And these adaptation approaches also would need to be developed for the oceans overall, because there's one core message, next please, that is actually coming from the findings in this special report as much as in the other special reports. The biosphere is suffering under climate change, and ecosystems are approaching, and some have already surpassed, hard adaptation limits. A very important goal of human adaptation measures needs to be the strengthening of the resilience of the biosphere against climate change. And there are various approaches that could be used in the ocean. Next click, please. One of them is setting up networks of protected areas which help maintain ecosystem services, including carbon uptake and storage, because that in turn will actually help long-term climate stabilization. And then enable future ecosystem-based adaptation options by facilitating the poleward movements of species, populations, and ecosystems. We cannot, under progressive degrees of warming, keep those ecosystems in place. And again, the key message is emissions reduction is first and is a precondition for us being able to stabilize these systems at all and for strengthening their resilience. Next click, please. This actually includes, and that's a rather recent insight coming from the first joint IPBES-IPCC report on climate change and biodiversity. It's important to reduce marine sediment disturbance, which holds huge carbon stores previously underestimated. So bottom trawling activities should be reduced as much as possible. Next slide, please. And then there's marine habitat restoration to be mentioned. Using ecosystem management tools such as assisted species relocation, coral gardening. These can be locally effective, but once again, need to emphasize these become ineffective if global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees by much, because especially the most sensitive systems are already at high risk. Next click, please. And we should be strengthening precautionary approaches, such as rebuilding overexploited or depleted fisheries and responsiveness of existing fisheries management strategies, which reduce negative climate change impacts on fisheries with benefits for regional economies and livelihoods. So these are statements which are mixed from the special report on ocean and cryosphere and also from the IPCC report, which may be guiding some of the discussion that should be happening after that. And with that, next slide, please. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Portner, for setting the scene and underscoring the need for urgent action on climate adaptation in coastal areas. Now, we'd really like to get a sense of who is in the virtual room with us today. So I'm going to hand the floor over to my colleague, Amber, to lead a brief Mentimeter exercise.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Amber Bier, and I work on ecosystem-based adaptation over at IUCN. And I will be facilitating a short check-in today with our audience using Mentimeter. We'd like for you to join us on Mentimeter just for a few moments to get a better understanding, as Emily mentioned, of who is joining the session. To join, please use the link in the chat or go to menti.com and type in the code you see at the top of the screen. That's also in the chat. So once we can see a few people joining, we will flip to the first question. And for the first question, we would love to see where in the world you are joining us from. Specifically, which country are you joining us from today? So it looks like we have quite a span. USA in there a few times from different acronyms. A lot of individuals from Germany, from France, maybe some folks from Marseille in person, from the Seychelles, from Philippines, Cambodia. Excellent. So it seems like we have quite a diverse spread of not only time zones, but also countries and territories around the world. So thank you everyone for getting up for your early morning or spending your afternoon or evening with us. So we'll go to the next question, which is, what type of organization do you work for? We're proud to have a diverse set of speakers and panelists today representing NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, a research institute, and the private sector as well. And so as we discuss the need to break silos and build bridges across organizations and sectors, it's interesting to see where our participants are joining in from. It looks like we have quite a spread. 30% is the most for international non-governmental organizations, and shortly followed, or now taking the lead, by intergovernmental organizations. Looks like there's also an interest from private sector and government as well as university or other academic institutions. Awesome. So quite a spread here. And now on to just the last Mentimeter question quickly. How familiar are you with the topics we are addressing today? This question is just to see and gauge how interested and how familiar our participants are with the issues listed here. So we know you may have varying degrees of familiarity with ecosystem-based adaptation, or EBA, or nature-based solutions, also known as NBS, as well as technological adaptation solutions. So we're curious to see where our participants fall. And for the third item on the screen, just to elaborate a bit, maybe you already have a lot of expertise in integrating the two, or perhaps you're not sure how they truly relate to one another. So let us know on the sliding scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is you're not familiar and 10 is an expert, self-proclaimed or otherwise. So it looks like we're kind of in the middle. It looks like most participants are familiar most with EBA and NBS, with adaptation technology shortly thereafter. And you can see sort of the curve underneath the line shows where participants are landing. So a lot in the middle, some on the higher and lower, of course, but excellent to see we have some diversity. And on the third question on how EBA/NBS and adaptation technologies sort of intertwine and synergize, it looks like individuals are about 3.9. So they know a bit, they're familiar, halfway between not familiar and expert. So that's a good place to be. And hopefully today we can expand on that third point as well as the first two. Thank you everyone for participating in the Mentimeter. I will now hand it back to Emily to transition us to the moderated panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Amber. That's fantastic to get a sense of who's in the room with us today. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to hand over the floor to our moderator for the panel discussion, Ali Raza Rizvi. Ali is the Global Coordinator for Adaptation and Disaster Risk Reduction at IUCN and Senior Advisor for Resilience. Ali, over to you.
Thank you, Emily. I'm pleased to moderate this panel discussion on successful innovative models and approaches, lessons learned, and good practices in integrating technological and ecosystem-based approaches for climate change adaptation in coastal and ocean communities. We just heard that how critical it is that to break these silos, and then it has been pointed out that ecosystems and technology, they need to be integrated to response to the challenges. So we will start with a brief initial intervention from each panelist, followed by a moderated question and answer. Please drop your questions for our distinguished panelists in the Zoom chat, and we will be sure to ask a few towards the end of the question and answer. Our panelists today represent diverse organizations and sector and will address topics including emerging technologies and hybrid approaches that have high potential to meaningfully build resilience in ocean and coastal settings, innovative approaches to integrate technological and nature-based solutions in policy and practice, how indigenous and local knowledge have contributed to hybrid solutions for adaptation, and the importance of safeguards and diversity, including youth, indigenous, and women's perspective when designing and implementing climate adaptation interventions. On the panel, we have Patricia Annett. Patricia serves as a Marine Special Planning North Sea focal point at the EU MSP assistance mechanisms of the European Commission. She is also a representative of the Nairobi Work Program Expert Group on Oceans, who supported tech in the preparation of the policy brief on technologies in coastal zones. Emily Corwin is the Director of Nature-Based Engineering Solutions at Conservation International, where she is creating the science solution partnerships and field examples needed to bring an innovative green-gray infrastructure approach to the world's most vulnerable communities. Sylvester Wong works on urban planning, technology, and resilience as the Vice President, Asia Pacific and Cities for the company AECOM. Vivian Gotnes, Dr. Vivian is a scientist analyst with Science Space LLC at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York, and also associated with the Columbia University Center for Climate Systems Research. Her research on coastal impact of sea level rise contributed to the recent New York panel on climate change report in 2019. Serena Heckler joins us from UNESCO, where she is an advisor for ecological and earth sciences. She previously specialized in small island and indigenous knowledge at UNESCO. I would like to now invite each of our panelists to give a brief initial intervention, which will be followed by a moderated discussion. So first, we will be hearing from Patricia Annett. So Patricia, over to you.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this distinctive meeting. Myself, over the last 20 years, I have been working both with the development and implementation of various innovative approaches for coastal and ocean adaptation, and I also had the honor to assist the Technology Executive Committee in the development of the policy brief, jointly with the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage on the topic of technologies for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage in coastal zones. There are a big landscape of technologies for strengthening adaptation and comprehensive building of resilience has been identified. Today, I would like to specifically highlight the need for the implementation of integrated ecosystem-based approaches, where the examples of such holistic approach is marine spatial planning. Why integrated approaches for ocean and coastal areas are so important is because we want to deliver a comprehensive management approach, provide sustainable development of ocean measures and solutions, and provide for long-term strengthening of coastal and ocean adaptation. And that means not only the development of a certain area for the application of a nature-based solution or other technology, but also how it works to serve the purpose, how it's supported and benefited to make the technology performing over a long time. For this, as highlighted in the policy brief, there is a need to use various technologies, physical equipment and capital goods, and also the processes, knowledge and skills, as well as policies, regulation, governance structures. I will give now example of how to encompass these different types of technologies for long-term operating, and that is under integrated framework of marine spatial planning, which I focus due to my affiliation. As an MSP North Sea focal point at the European MSP Assistance Mechanism and Platform, I assist the member states in the implementation of the EU MSP directive, and that is a policy and law in the European Union for all EU member states. The MSP goal is to reduce the environmental risk of the activities being planned at sea across borders and sectors. And what is important is that the ecosystem-based approach together with sustainability is a core part of MSP in Europe, and also long-term challenges are considered by member states in the development of their MSPs. How it is done, EU member states apply a stepwise approach to integrate ecosystem-based technologies and approaches into the MSP process at each step of the MSP planning cycle. This process includes working with stakeholders, integrating the data, planning for the implementation process, monitoring and evaluation. And based on the experiences in the EU, we see that the MSP process is as important as the plan, and the process uses a number of innovative technologies. For example, for data collection, information sharing, ecosystem nature-based technologies, among others. We also see in the region that nature-based solutions are increasingly used for bringing together biodiversity and climate. The EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 from last year calls for revising biodiversity laws, restoring ecosystems and increasing protection area. And now we have here the challenge, because the challenge is for the countries and MSP authorities how to increase the biodiversity protection of the seas, while EU seas are overcrowded with economic activities, and in some territorial waters, such as in the North Sea, protection areas are jointly with other activities. Also, space sharing conflicts are rising, for example, for the designation of MPAs, marine protected areas, and offshore wind farms that can take space away from fisheries or other activities. Therefore, these problems, they require technological innovations due to reduced space in the sea. Now, how these challenges are being tackled in Europe? For example, future MSP revisions provide the opportunity to address them. For space conflicts, what is increasingly practiced is space sharing technologies, so-called multi-use, so coexistence of activities such as offshore renewable energy structures with aquaculture, seaweed farming or oyster farming, which contribute to restoring natural ecosystems, and at the same time they ensure the food security. But also offshore wind farms, they coexist with or actively support marine conservation. Now, example from Belgium, Belgium's MSP foresees the possibility of use of wind farm areas for aquaculture, and in the Netherlands, single-use areas are designated only where needed. Mostly it's multi-use. Now, finally, another key challenge, which will be the last one, is that some member states have not yet established management plans for the marine protected areas. And there is an opportunity, again, to use the MSP process as an incentive for the development of site management plans, as it was done in Belgium and in the Netherlands. In Belgium, work for the MSP led to a stronger restriction in one marine protected site, while in the Netherlands, the process to develop the country's first MSP led to the identification of new protection sites and the development of management plans for some existing sites. Now, I will stop here by highlighting that having the overall principle of ecosystem-based approach, sustainable development and climate goals embedded in marine spatial planning makes possible integration of various ecosystem, nature-based technologies for ocean and coastal planning, for resilience building in ocean and coastal settings, and also, and that's very important, for advancement of innovative approaches to strengthening ocean and coastal adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia, for sharing these practical examples, and we will come back to you again. Now I'll invite Emily Corwin from CI. So over to you, Emily.
Great, thanks, Ollie. And thank you to IUCN, FEBA, the Tech, and the Nairobi Work Program for organizing the session today. So one of the adaptation technologies our team at Conservation International is working to advance is green-gray infrastructure. And the photo on the slide is from Guyana and is a good visual of what green-gray infrastructure is. So in this case, restored mangroves are located in front of a strengthened seawall. And the mangroves and the seawall complement each other to reduce the exposure and risk of climate threats like sea level rise and storm surge to communities living along the coast. Next slide. And this is both critical and urgent because, as we just heard, we are facing unprecedented global impacts to people and infrastructure. So this is another photo from the coastline in Guyana where mangroves have been removed, leaving communities even more exposed to sea level rise and storm surge. So one thing that gives me hope about the future is the vision that we have for Green Gray and all the various ways that Green Gray projects can integrate across a landscape as a climate adaptation strategy and add value to planned and necessary future infrastructure projects. Our goal is to integrate nature into the trillions of dollars that will be spent on infrastructure development in the next 20 years. And in the process, realize benefits for biodiversity, livelihoods, and both climate mitigation and adaptation. So we've identified 4 primary barriers to achieving this vision, and I want to introduce them. The first is that engineers, developers, industry, governments lack experience and consequently confidence in the reliability of these combined green-gray approaches. The second is that technical knowledge and data that's needed to standardize these types of solutions is not yet broadly or equitably available. The third is that most infrastructure policies and regulations don't currently incentivize green-gray or hybrid solutions. And fourth, there are real and perceived risks that constrain investments in developing economies, despite the significant opportunities for green-gray to achieve social, economic, and environmental objectives at a competitive cost. With colleagues from around the world, we're working to address these barriers and fundamentally transform the engineering and construction industry to design and build with nature, to create the next generation of climate resilient infrastructure. And to achieve that goal, we're innovating pilot projects, expanding science and engineering know-how, building the business case for investment in green-gray alternatives, and recommending policy. We very much look forward to the opportunity to participate in a future working group and contribute to guidelines on integrating technologies like green-gray into adaptation projects. Back to you, Ali.
Thank you, Emily. Now we will hear from Sylvester Wong. Sylvester, over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Ali. And it's great to see all the different projects that are happening around the world. You know, looking after cities and resilience in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, where I'm located. But, you know, technology is worldwide, isn't it? You know, back in Silicon Valley, you know, we've been working on things to create climate change preparedness by harnessing technology to be online with decision support systems, GIS, Southeast Florida, working with Urban Land Institute to do business cases. This is all harnessing data and using technology to reach out to people. But I want to share with you a little bit from where I'm living. You know, I've lived in Asia for the past 2 decades now, and it is severe out here. I mean, we've got ring of fire, we've got disappearing mangroves and reefs, we've got extreme weather. And I got to share with you, I'm really impressed with our teams right now, harnessing data. In Hong Kong, for example, where Typhoon Mangkhut a couple years ago took out $500 million in losses. And it was then that it wasn't just about an environmental or a climate change that's off in the distance. This impacted everybody. And I think we're seeing that worldwide right now, that it's time, everyone's waking up. And so we've been helping the whole territory, right, all 1,200 square kilometers, to understand through data what the potential storm paths are, what the hydraulic modeling is like, and through that, deploy the limited resources to help reinforce Hong Kong. And one of the cool projects that have come out of that is a biomimicked reef system along a new shoreline where we are using 3D printing, using a special pH balanced concrete that's a little bit more, you know, actually compatible with hosting living reef systems at this new shoreline so that it can create storm surge buffers and so forth. There's so much, and you know, it's very much in line with what Emily's talking about, this green-gray infrastructure. But nothing beats real reefs, right? So, I mean, the work we're doing in Australia with the Great Barrier Reef, all that bleaching that's happening, it's called the Resilient Reefs Program. We're doing it with Reef Ecologic, and it's empowering multiple local stakeholders to use science and data to come up with really impactful micro projects across the entire reef. It's not one solution fits all. And we certainly believe that even though we're a very large company, we look for very localized solutions. For example, in Singapore, you know, we do have a venture arm. We're looking at different companies and startups. The real future is not just the big companies, but these great entrepreneurs who are coming up with stuff. I just got off the phone earlier today with a startup that is doing vertical aquaculture. So creating an ability to not have these destructive shrimp farms that are destroying mangroves all over, especially in the global south, but creating job opportunity and food security, especially in some places like Singapore. They think about that all the time. And then the big vision is to have part of a circular economy in cities where the heat exchange and the waste and the oxygen carbon sort of cycle can be combined with other large heat generating centers in these districts. You've seen it in the new Microsoft campus in the US, for example, that the center of attention is not like a brand new building of some kind, it's the geothermal plant. And I'm going to bring us to, you know, Singapore and Southeast Asia, the global South. That's where I live. I live in the Philippines right now, and I chose the Philippines because, I mean, that's where the need is the most. It's so such an example of many of these other demographically exploding places that are facing these urbanization challenges. And we're working with Conservation International on pilot projects that are looking at riparian and wetland and coastal restoration so that we get living reefs, green-gray infrastructure, mangrove restoration. And, you know, but across the global South, the core issue is finance. How do you fund these programs? And this is where technology, after data and biomimicry and all sorts of new startups, comes down, I think, to the most important part of technology, which is people. And technology and the ability to bring knowledge out to communities across the global South, outside of the main city centers, where people can make real change but don't have the tools or the finance to do it. So we're working through ability to take technology and crowdsource multiple carbon sequestration projects. One by itself, 2, 3, hard to make a difference. But when you crowdsource them, you scale the capacity building through online technologies and then use financial technologies to securitize those projects and put them into the carbon trading market. Now, carbon trading, I mean, no, it's a last mile, last resort. We all want to make sure everybody's actually doing real work. But for the next 10 years or so, as people are committed, there is a market. And so I think it's time that we can harness some of that interesting financial power to create projects in the global South that can restore a lot of our coastal defenses and help communities worldwide. And you'll finally see behind me a photo of one of the projects in the Philippines, which bring this to light. Technology can mean data, it can mean these cool built environment things, but at the end of the day, it's people harnessing technology that empowers the next generations to fight for and secure our future. A lot of what we're trying to do at AECOM, called Scope X, is to harness that knowledge across our business to help every project that we touch cumulatively reduce the carbon footprint of our clients' work by 50% in the next 10 years. That's what we call our sustainable legacies. So Ali, back to you after it's about data, nature, people, empowerment of entrepreneurial urgency. Thanks.
Thank you, Sylvester. and bringing the attention to data-driven and other. And I'm happy we also have now intervention from Vivian Gordnis. And Vivian, I suppose you will also be talking about data-driven decision-making and how we can further enhance and build upon ecosystem approaches by bringing in data integration and other. So over to you, Vivian.
Yes, I've been working with the New York City panel on climate change, and that is an advisory body consisting of academic scientists, city officials, and private sector and NGO representatives. And we provide information on climate change impacts for the city of New York. And some of the key elements that are involved are that we employ the latest scientific information in making future projections. And we take a flexible adaptation approach toward implementation. In other words, that the changes that need to be made are done in stages relating to what the climate projections are telling us, because it's very difficult to forecast 100 years ahead of time. So let's just take it in increments of 30 or 50 years at a time and plan ahead accordingly and make adjustments as needed in the future. And another key element is that we involve a diverse group of stakeholders ranging from city and state officials to representatives of local communities, and many of which are from minority groups. And with the understanding that the adaptation measures that are recommended are tailored to the needs of the specific communities, that one approach isn't the best for the entire city because the needs may vary from one locality to another. And among the successes is that the city has taken a lead in implementing climate change adaptation measures, including coastal resiliency, particularly following Hurricane Sandy a number of years ago. And they have developed, based on our projections, have developed a flood risk mapping tool that one can check one's location against the degree of risk of coastal flooding. And there's also been a strengthening of the city's building codes to make buildings more flood resilient in high risk flood areas. And another thing that the city has done has to create shoreline parks, certainly more developed along the shoreline of Manhattan, but also in Brooklyn and other boroughs. And these can act as buffer zones against flooding, but also serve as recreation areas where you can engage in walking, in biking, and some of the old piers that used to be used for shipping can now be used for various sport activities as well. And they're also building berms in certain high-risk areas and other improvements, coastal and structural improvements, and working with the federal and state agencies. The city is also engaged in restoration efforts in Jamaica Bay, which has the Salt Marsh Islands is a major nature preserve, and it's part of the National Recreation area. And in addition to that, there's been a lot of street plantings and pocket parks dotted throughout the city. And our recent experience with the northern extension of Hurricane Ida, this extremely heavy rainfall event that we had last week, has taught us a lesson that Street flooding is another concern. We've been focusing mostly on coastal adaptation, but we may also need to deal with how to mitigate street flooding from heavy rainfall, unusually heavy rainfall, which is projected to become much more common event in the future. Now, while the city has been very progressive in addressing climate change issues and has made efforts in mitigating carbon emissions and the like, the thing that I'm seeing is that, on the other hand, there's been a lot of development, if not overdevelopment, in the coastal zone, high-rise buildings being built in high flood risk areas, and that even if the buildings are flood resilient and perhaps the ground floor is not being used for more than just a lobby or some, very open space area, nevertheless, the transportation to and from the street level flooding could become a problem in these high risk areas, and that hasn't really been addressed. And although the reports that we have issued have been tailored specifically for New York City, the framework approach that we adopt can be extended for use in other urban and areas and other coastal settlements, because we take a multi-component approach to sea level rise, which includes global as well as local elements. And so that there is a downscaling component that can adjust climate change projections to local conditions. And so there is this potential for adaptability in other areas as well.
Thank you, Vivian, for sharing all the examples and science-based decision-making in New York City, which is helping with flood management and sea level rise. Now, from all these, let's go to how indigenous knowledge is helping to have better adaptation together with all science and how we can better integrate it. So Serena Heckler, you have huge experience of working over here, so over to you.
Thank you very much, Ali, and thank you very much to IUCN for inviting me. I've been invited to speak today about one of the greatest endeavors of humankind, and I just have a few minutes to cover that, so I'll delve right in. Between roughly 3,500 and 800 years ago, humans populated the Pacific, which covers roughly 1/3 of the globe's surface and is one of the most important carbon sinks of the planet. And by all evidence, these humans kept up exchange and cultural dialogue throughout that whole time and throughout the pre-colonial period. The knowledge and technology upon which this human endeavor was based, which we're calling today ancestral voyaging knowledge, can be roughly lumped into two major categories. This is navigational knowledge, knowledge of the stars, but also an incredibly intricate and detailed knowledge of ocean currents over this vast space, swells, marine and coastal wildlife and birds, weather patterns, detailed knowledge of ocean geography over vast distances, which were transmitted orally through chants, songs, and mnemonic devices. And you see here on the screen a couple of those devices. There's a diagram here of how people from Setawal in what's today the Federated States of Micronesia would transfer this device standing in one place and just learn by heart the islands and the animals, the marine mammals that they might find, whales and dolphins and seabirds turning around in circles. And then these others are the famous stick charts that people would build on the beaches that could mimic the ocean currents and swells that might be found around an island land or in the open sea to help novices learn how to recognize those swells. And in fact, there's a famous story about a famous Tongan navigator who could find her way. And yes, there were famous navigators who were women, even in pre-colonial times, who could find her way simply by lying in the bottom of the boat and feeling the way the swells would move the boat from Samoa to Fiji to Tonga. So there's a lot more to it than knowing about the stars. It's about understanding the ocean ecology and the ocean currents. And then there's the boat building technology. If you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. There's the boat building technology, and this involves having incredibly detailed knowledge of island ecosystems to know which plants and vines and trees to harvest, knowing the biology, knowing when to harvest them, knowing the weather patterns, knowing the community, having a community organization because entire communities would work together to build these incredible feats of engineering and inter-island trade. And these boats would support social organization. They could carry heavy loads and large groups of people over vast distances. And they would do this without damaging the reefs, without damaging the ecosystems. Both men and women were knowledge holders, and diverse knowledges developed across the region. And you can see on this slide a boat from the Taumako Islands and the Solomon Islands, the canoes. These are more hybrid technologies now more recently from the canoes of the Marshall Island group, Juan Elon en Mahel, and this is the Okeanos Foundation project. These are fiberglass hybrid technologies that we see. Perhaps you're more familiar with these types of vessels across the Pacific now, the Utonialo from Fiji and the Utonialo Trust that you see today. So this is right across the Pacific that you see these vessels today. In the 20th century, we came very close to losing this knowledge completely, but a few visionary master navigators, which we called Puo, including Mau Pialung of Setual in Micronesia, together with the founders of the Polynesian Voyaging Society from Hawaii, and Te Aliki Kawaya of Taumako Island in the Solomon Islands, shared their knowledge with a wide range of partners, including IUCN, Conservation International, and UNESCO, amongst many others. So I'm here as a humble partner to talk about the work that we have the privilege to share through our interactions with these master navigators on our platform, which is the Canoe is the People, which both serves to support education, grassroots education and community level education, which serves as a sort of supporting a sort of education of attention to help communities turn the attention back to seeing the oceans and the coasts and the reefs again in the full intricate detail of what they are. And I'll return to that point in just a minute. The foundation of the success of ancestral voyaging knowledge and its application to strengthening coastal adaptation must be the voyaging societies. It's not about bringing knowledge to the communities. It's about harvesting the knowledge that's already existing in those communities to form the foundation of a truly endogenous Pacific development. And they have applied this knowledge to a broad range of the most pressing development challenges facing the Pacific and the world today: biodiversity conservation, ocean pollution, economic development, disaster response and risk reduction, education, community health, and of course, resilient climate change adaptation. And because time is so short, I'm going to give just one example of the many ways that the voyaging societies across the Pacific are applying this technology and knowledge. one of the primary adaptation challenges throughout the Pacific, and we've discussed this in several of the talks today, is coastal erosion and adaptation. And as already Emily mentioned in her talk, a first reaction is to build seawalls. And this is often done on a local scale using materials that can be good materials. It can be very thoroughly thought out and engineered. But as Sylvester mentioned, people in the Pacific are on the front lines. In the Philippines, they're on the front lines. In Hong Kong, they're on the front lines. In Apia, in Suva, in the Marshall Islands, in Majuro, they're on the front lines. They're hit over and over and over again. And these seawalls don't hold up very well. And what we're seeing with the climate projections is that to be effective, the seawalls need to be implausibly high. We're seeing projections of 20-meter seawalls all the way around the island. Extraordinarily well engineered and taking into account extraordinarily complex current flows and knock-on effects to be effective against what's coming. And on the other hand, and Hans showed us the really grim predictions for coral reefs throughout the Pacific, but we're also seeing some local studies that are showing that at a local level, some of the reefs are being more resilient than what's being predicted. And what we need to do is work with the communities to ensure that they're doing the best they can for their reefs, because what we're seeing is that at the moment, these reefs, in some cases, are the best defense, and the mangroves, as Emily pointed out, are the best defense for sea level rise. And to do this, the communities must understand the reefs. And in too many cases, they haven't understand them. And we need to understand them as well. The scientists need to understand them. The communities need to understand them. And the best way to do that is what we're calling knowledge co-production. And in the environmental education activities that Utoni Yalo in Fiji is doing, that Maru Maru Atua in Cook Islands is doing, that Naualofa in Samoa is doing, that the Vakavalo Association in Taumako and Solomon Islands, Tonga Voyaging Society in Tonga is doing, and others are doing, is the best way of doing that. It really lights up the kids if you've ever seen it happening. We can also tailor local sea transport to protect the reefs. You can see from this vessel, the Te Puke, and the others, that some of these vessels can come in over the reef. They can carry heavy loads and lots of people and come in over the reef without damaging it. You can build harbors for these vessels that don't get damaged in sea storms, and you don't need to dig deep harbors. You don't need to have lots of diesel fuel. They don't cause spills. They don't cause pollutions. Much more resilient reefs, sustainable sea transport, and you can get goods in without the big economies of scale that are also choking local adaptation economic initiatives. And so that's just one concrete example of what these voyaging societies are doing. But again, I emphasize this has to be led by the voyaging societies, and they reach out to partners. They lead this, and they reach out to partners and ask them for their support and help. With that, again, I want to thank them. Fa'afetai telelava, vinakavaka levu, metaki ma'ata. I'll leave that with that for now.
Thank you, Serena. And thank you to all of our panelists for the introduction and the discussion and the sharing of the information and knowledge. And one thing is coming along, it's not either or, which was initially shared at the beginning by Emily Goodwin, that, we have to move forward in an integrated approach. There are thousands of years of indigenous knowledge. They know their local ecosystems and the challenges. And now with this, the only thing is that their local knowledge and indigenous, are being outpaced by climate change. So science and data and climate data that needs to be integrated out so that, we can maximize on the investment which is being done by taxpayers' money. So many, now we know the donors are out there who are, making innovative decisions also, BMU ICI is one good example. Others are also coming along who are learning and changing the modus operandi. So it's critical that we have integrated approaches So as we move to the moderated discussion and some of the questions coming along, please do feel free, all our audience, to put some questions, and then we will be asking our panelists. So some questions. Patricia, I'll start with you. In your experience from the assistance mechanism, what practices have shown the good way to improve or scale up innovative approaches in Europe? You have resources, you have other challenges, but if very briefly you can share what is working and good way to improve or scale up. So, Patricia.
Thank you, Ali, for the question. Yes, we see in Europe how the policy and law have helped the countries to mobilize and develop national plans that improves to scale up innovative approaches for resilience building. We also see how co-financing and funding from the EU funds has helped for countries to work together across the sea basins and transboundary, and contributed to the wider stakeholder engagement. Now, just a few examples. The transboundary collaboration we normally have on a sea basin scale. We also see now increasingly that there is across the sea basins. For instance, now is the new project for the North Sea and for the Baltic Sea. So that's going beyond one sea. So more countries are collaborating. We have the sea basin strategies, the WestMed in the Mediterranean, VASAP in the Baltic, and the Sim Atlantic project that is leading towards the strategy in the Atlantic. Now, at the national level, we have a community of practice, for instance, in the Netherlands, that incorporates resilience ecosystems, sustainable energy, and future food-proof production. So these are very, very important elements together with the EU-funded projects and initiatives. And it's a very, very big, long list of these projects in Europe in different sea bases and practices of development of tools, data, and methods for the planners, for the decision makers, as well as for the stakeholders in the MSP process. And lastly, to mention the EU information mechanisms that play a crucial role in Europe is exactly what I'm representing, the European MSP platform that aims at knowledge sharing and broad-scale dissemination and communication to the stakeholders for the ecosystem-based approaches in the marine waters. Well, I can continue, but just to mention that we have many, many good approaches.
Yeah, no, practices. I understand there is so much to share. And, always these, discussions we have, we find it very hard that maybe, we should have longer discussions, but we, as, was shared earlier, we will continue with this, and there would be a series of, other discussions so that, we can move forward together and have all this information available and knowledge sharing. So I'll come to you, Emily, now. What's the scale of the opportunity if the engineering and construction industry were to adopt green gray infrastructure as standard practice? What are your experiences and the opportunity for scaling up? So Emily Carvin?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. So it's estimated that every year $1.8 trillion is invested in coastal infrastructure like roads, seaports, water, and wastewater treatment. So we don't yet know what percentage of those investments globally or even within specific countries could be a good fit for green gray infrastructure or green gray alternative. And it's something we're working on. But let's say it's 5% of the annual investments in coastal infrastructure. That's $90 million every year that it could improve the resiliency of assets, while also restoring and conserving ecosystems that provide co-benefits for people on the planet. So one of the things that we've also been looking at is where the kind of highest priorities or biggest opportunities are to invest in these green gray infrastructure alternatives. And we think the biggest opportunity will be finding those assets that are both vulnerable to climate impacts and good candidates for these hybrid approaches. So we recently conducted a survey to identify which asset classes these might be. And our initial results are that we think the biggest opportunities to invest in green gray adaptation alternatives will be for seaports that are adapting to sea level rise and coastal flooding, roads as there need to be investments to adapt them to riverine flooding, and water and wastewater facilities adapting to both coastal and river flooding.
Thank you, Emily. It's quite very good analysis, and that can help us in making decisions and then see how best we can maximize on these opportunities which potentially they appear. And so let's see how happens in future, but this is good to know with all this grim picture, things can be done differently. Sylvester, could you elaborate your intervention and the entry points for the private sector to integrate nature-based approaches into traditionally gray infrastructure, heavy adaptation strategies? Sylvester?
That's a great question. Thanks. I was wondering how to follow Emily after talking about infrastructure. And maybe, you know what? Maybe I don't talk about infrastructure because, you know, the challenge ahead of us is bigger, as Serena had very well put, bigger than any one or multiple projects can solve. And when you look at some of these big megalopolises, tens of millions, Greater Bay Area in China, right? Hong Kong, the Guangzhou, this is 70 million people on thousands of square kilometers, all threatened with inundation. You know, I talked to some of these real estate investment trusts, right? These asset managers, these folks in finance, and they're with it now. They're saying, hey, I don't want stranded assets on my portfolio. I want to make sure that we're out of those hazard zones. But if you look then at where the biggest challenges are, I mean, we're talking about people with the money to maybe help with a just transition, right? A transition out of these hazard zones so that instead of battling it, you just kind of let nature take, you know, adaptation, like you said, Ali, is a combination of solutions, right? But what about the people right at the front line who, you know, after Yolanda or Haiyan, as it was known, in 2013, I think it was, in the Philippines, battered Tacloban, facing the Pacific. Terrible tragedy. And a lot of aid companies went in there, aid organizations, and tried to help by creating housing outside of the flood zone areas. And yet, just as many of these efforts to try to help, you know, might need a little bit more, is that the core thing that's been driving people to these actually highly threatened hazard zones, inundation zones, and so forth, is economy, is jobs, the simple access to livelihood. And so after a while, folks who moved into high ground, they were fisher people, and they had to go back so that they could get what they knew, which was how to fish. So I think financial infrastructure is going to be one of the biggest technological things that we can do to harness and help community members and champions within those community members to lift themselves out, to build household equity. I mean, folks here who are in those hazard areas are because they can't afford to purchase a home or have a place where they can access jobs and provide for their family. Having insurance, I mean, insurance sounds very dry, but actually insurance is a huge piece of the potential solution to allowing people to not start over from zero anytime a typhoon hits. You know, anytime their flood is either their homes are flooded out. And you'll see, and you talk to a lot of the insurance companies, they value resilience, and you know, by offering lower premiums and things like that. And Vivian was talking about New York, right? The big resilience plan around the edge of New York. Part of it is being enabled because insurance companies are coming in to underwrite a lot of the resilience measures. So yeah, it's sort of open-ended conversation, but I think it's not just about physical solutions. Of course, we're very happy to help with physical solutions, but it's about people and finance as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvester. It's so critical that, you know, we cannot look into and do anything on climate adaptation and tackling any climate associated challenges in isolation. Everything is interconnected, and that's where we need to come. If there is poverty, if there is biodiversity loss, in the end, we cannot have adaptation. And then now with climate change, everything maybe need to be redefined, as you said. So Vivian, you've been deeply involved in research and future present sea level rise. How can the innovative application of climate science and technology inform the selection and implementation of technological and nature-based solutions? So very briefly, if you can just elaborate on that point, Vivian.
Well, we make a point of engaging with stakeholders, both on the city level and also community groups and some private sector groups as well, in presenting what the climate change challenges are and the possible approaches that can be taken. It is up to the city to actually implement these, and that also depends on the political will, and luckily I think New York City is takes a much more progressive approach and has done steps toward carbon emissions reduction and instituting as you call it, green-gray solutions, where they are expanding the number of trees that are planted and converting the former shoreline that was used mainly for shipping and has long been sort of abandoned and neglected into new park areas that are open to all forms of recreation, from simply walking, biking, and various other sports activities, cultural events, and the like.
Thank you, Vivian. Serena, you shared very well about the indigenous knowledge, and that can clearly provide an immense amount of value to the development of both technology and EBA approaches. But how can we scale up consideration of indigenous and local knowledge in the processes of designing, implementing, and monitoring adaptation solutions? So scaling up for design, implementation, and M&E of these solutions.
So there are a number of projects that are doing that. At the Pacific level, for instance, you do have the Pacific Voyaging Societies work together at the regional level. And they have regional conferences that are working together and contributing with their partners to various instruments, both at the regional and global level, to lay out policy positions for how this work should be contributing to technology development. And so there's been some work about developing sustainable sea transport technologies. I already mentioned things like developing policies for routes, and I don't want to get into that because that's also very political. But at the national level, for instance, there's a lot of issues about economies of scale and providing national, and I mean, we're talking about, when we talk national in the Pacific, we're talking about territories like Kiribati that have tiny little islands that cover thousands upon tens of thousands of square kilometers of sea area, and Cook Islands as well, where maybe an island with 5,000 people can only have a boat arrive there once every 6 months, which obviously provides some real problems for what they can do economically in terms of adaptation activities for green local economies. There are sustainable sea transport hybrid activities that you can do using sail technologies that can help that process. And then there are things that you can do in terms of, I think it was mentioned by Hans, the disturbing the sea floor. And they see themselves as guardians of the Pacific. And that because they know the Pacific and they observe, and there's this education of attention, they're also very often the first people to see changes. They're not the last, they're the first ones that see things changing. And we saw that back in the 1990s with Indigenous and local knowledge holders in the Arctic. They were the first ones that were seeing some of the changes that now the scientists in the IPCC reports are saying, this is what's happening in the Arctic. And they were saying that in the 2000s. Well, the Indigenous knowledge holders were saying that in the 1990s. So that's another area that this can be scaled up. But it does need to go through, importantly, safeguards of free, prior, informed consent. And those are starting to be embedded into certain processes through IPBES, through IPCC, through UNFCCC. So
Right.
just in short, that's an answer.
Thank you, Serena. There's never enough time to have, in-depth discussions, it seems like. So as we conclude the panel discussion, I would like to give each of our panelists a chance to give just take-home message, 30 seconds, please, before I hand over to Rohina. So last take-home message, Serena, let's start with you. Just 30 seconds, please.
Take-home message, let's revitalize the knowledge that people have in their communities. Remember, I think Sylvester mentioned the global south, but also the global now. People have knowledge, they're observing changes. Let's work with that and build on that and build knowledge co-production processes and intercultural dialogues to find those solutions and work together
Serena.
to build that.
Sylvester, your 30 seconds.
I'll keep it short. Technology at the end empowers people, and people will be the source of this change. So let's be empowered.
Great. That's wonderful. Vivian?
I would say that both science-based knowledge as well as working closely with a variety of stakeholders and taking an adaptation, a flexible adaptation pathway approach are the ways forward to adapting to climate change and increasing coastal resilience.
Thank you, Vivian. Patricia?
Well, 30 seconds. More concrete, evidence-based targets and innovative technologies, I think, are needed, and a big landscape of technologies for strengthening adaptation. Comprehensive, and I highlighted comprehensive building of resilience is needed, ensuring the coherence of efforts through a comprehensive risk management, and very importantly, to respond to priority technology needs as identified by governments.
Thank you. Emily.
Thanks, Ali. I think I'll end with just making the connection for national governments by investing in these green-gray infrastructure alternatives. There's co-benefits of contributing to sustainable development goals, and we've seen that in some of the analysis that we've done, particularly in Colombia, around a road resiliency project there. And by integrating green-gray solutions that particularly involve mangroves that we know are carbon capture, have great power to capture and sequester carbon, that there is ability to support nationally determined contributions also. So just highlighting the multi-benefits of maybe designing and building outside of the comfort zone that many have right now. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you to our 5 distinguished panelists for joining us today. We have enjoyed hearing your insights into this important topic of how to better integrate technological and ecosystem-based adaptation solutions. As the session draws to a close, I would now like to invite Rohina Mahendra from the UNFCCC Secretariat to provide the closing keynote and reflections. Rohina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Adi. And personally, I really enjoyed the meeting, and it was a learning experience for me as well. So there are distinguished speakers, panelists, audience, and colleagues. Let me start off by saying the Nairobi Work Program, the Secretary represents Nairobi Program. We're very pleased to collaborate with our expert group on oceans, and I'm very happy to sit Patricia on the panel, the Technology Executive Committee, and IUCN FEBA to organize this very first session as a part of a series of events we are going to delve into not just to explore our understanding, but also to promote, as we have heard from our panelists, on how we can promote innovative approaches to scale up adaptation technology to build resilience in oceans and coastal settings and beyond. Very, very quickly, ocean, coastal areas, and ecosystem are one of the mandated priority areas for Nairobi Work Program. It's a UNFCCC Knowledge Action Hub and Adaptation Resilience under the convention. And we have been working very closely with the Nairobi Work Program Expert Group on Oceans since 2019, in fact, to see how we can collectively strengthen action on ocean and climate adaptation under the UNFCCC process by addressing key ocean climate gaps. And this has been happening very much so in collaboration among the expert group members. Many of you represent here on the panel, and also with UNFCCC constituted bodies, partners of Nairobi Work Program, and other communities of practice. And we have seen this session as providing a very fantastic example of such collaboration, and very happy to be part of this. It's very difficult, I think, I would think a challenging job to provide my reflections, and I have been taking some keynotes from the engaging conversation with all of you as a panelist. We have learned the value of integrating joint approaches for both technology and ecosystem-based adaptation in various policy and programs, I think, through your insightful interventions. And this is very critical to build resilience of oceans and coastal ecosystems and communities. I have 4 key takeaways, if I can just provide it as my summative reflections. The first, the continually evolving challenge of climate change creates a moving target, and we all know that repeating past approaches would not be sufficient. In this regard, I think we've heard from panel that evidence-based targets are very much needed for coherent actions and impact at all levels, including, of course, at the national level. The second, we also heard from panelists about what is the role of integrated approaches in building resilience through a holistic lens? And here, I think we've heard a very insightful or very much insightful experience, I would say, on emerging technologies and hybrid integrated approaches. And they have not just only potential to build resilience, but also at the same time, I think we need to bear in mind or take into account the challenges and priorities that directly respond to need of communities. And here we heard about the livelihoods and also countries. The third was about the political drive and financial mobilization, while it is important to know that the innovative approach does exist for integrating technological and nature-based solution, we also need to make sure this comes with the required political drive. And we've heard from Emily about the national level impetus, including the NDCs and NAPs, perhaps, and also with the effective mobilization of financial resources, as well as enhancing action to access to finance at all levels. My final reflection was on people's lens. We also heard from, I think, all the panelists about inclusivity, about the intercultural dialogue, the knowledge co-production, and a long-term investment as a part of the long-term investment, if you will. And there, the overall feedback, at least the summative reflection, was engaging indigenous and local knowledge is very, very integral, but at the same time, it's important to use of innovative ways to bring scientific, local, and indigenous knowledge in developing. So in a way, we have to think about ways in which we can develop and promote localized hybrid solutions for adaptation that also empowers the next generation. That leads to our what this means for our long-term partnership, and as a discussion going into the session, also in terms of next step, which we are going to hear from Juana shortly. The discussions have also emphasized that long-term partnership are needed mostly to respond to the increasing threat of climate change and to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, where we already are very much unequivocal saying that business as usual approaches is not sufficient. And this also then respond to the priorities that governments have identified in the nationally determined contribution indices under the Paris Agreement. And secondly, of course, the long-term partnership is also very critical to promote and scale up innovative approaches to build the resilience of oceans and coastal communities. So in the Nairobi Work Program looks forward to engaging and continuing this partnership with the TEC, IUCN FEBA to support countries in this endeavor. And thank you so much, Ali, for this, and over to you.
Thank you, Rohina. Now I invite Vana Tanuchai-Vatna from the UNFCCC Secretariat, who will be delivering the closing remarks. Vana, over to you.
Okay. Good day, everyone. I don't know where you are, wherever you are, dear distinguished speakers and panelists and colleagues and audience. My name is Vana Tanuchai-Vatna. I am the manager of the technology team of the UNFCCC Secretariat. I'm also the sub-staff coordinator of the UNFCCC. It is my pleasure to join you today for this event. I would like to, at the outset, take this opportunity to extend my deep appreciation to the IUCN, the TEC, and the Nairobi Work Program colleagues for their excellent collaboration to make these events on ecosystem and technology, innovative approach to strengthening coastal and ocean development conclude in a successful manner today. I am very encouraged to hear the discussion and exchange of view among panelists and audience on how innovative approach for integrating technological and nature-based solutions could play a role in strengthening coastal and ocean adaptation. We also learned from today's discussion, success and challenge in different approach and what we can learn from them. We heard also how stakeholders have played different role in and contributed variously in a way to identify innovation and implement them, including the importance of considering gender responsiveness and indigenous knowledge as part of the solution. It is again underlined that accelerating and enabling innovation is critical when an effective long-term global response to climate change and promoting economic growth and sustainable development. We know that climate change or crisis continue and window for or opportunity for us to act are closing very fast. The world needs to step up effort in climate adaptation and building resilience. And one way to do that is to scale up our effort all together. Paris Agreement in the Article 10 call for cooperative action in enhancing technology development and transfer. Working together will not only ensure inclusivity, it will also ensure that we tackle the climate issue in a coordinated manner. Colleagues, as mentioned in the opening remark by the TEC chair earlier, the event today is the first of a series of Technology Day events in 2021 with a focus on coastal and ocean adaptation. The next Technology Day events related to this theme will take place under the Nairobi Work Program, events taking place in October as part of the informal activity by the substitute chair in the lead up to the Glasgow conference. The October event will see exchange and interaction with parties and non-party stakeholders and other UNFCCC bodies and mechanisms on potential uptake of the ecosystem-based approach to support countries in implementing their NAP and NDC. I look forward to seeing all of you again in this upcoming event in October. So on behalf of the UNFCCC's Climate Change Secretariat, I would like to thank all distinguished speakers and panelists for your contribution to this event and our excellent moderator for guiding us to the conclusion of the events. And above all, I would like to thank all participants who have joined this event today. And thank you very much. Please stay in good health. The Technology Event Day is now adjourned. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Vana, for the closing remarks. And thank you all of our speakers, panelists, and audience participants today. We look forward to continuing the collaboration on this pressing topic and hope to see you at our next event on integrating ecosystem and technology for climate adaptation in October. Let's take a picture of all the participants and our panelists. If you all can switch on your cameras, Amber will take a quick shot. So if you all please switch on your cameras, all those who want to be in part of this group photo. So Amber, over to you for any other instructions if I haven't.
Oh, you got it, Ali. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I can see quite a few extra faces. So thanks to all of our participants for tuning in at this last minute. So I'll take a photo in 3, 2, 1. Perfect. I think I got everyone.
Okay, thank you everyone. So stay safe and we will be in touch soon with the proceedings and then next program. So thank you everyone. Have a good day, evening and night. Bye.